10 long years of bloodshed, trickery, and divine intervention has echoed through history to the present day, inspiring historians, screenwriters, and Redditors alike. In honor of the hotly debated Odyssey movie coming out in July of 2026, I wanted to take a look at what the laws of the Mycenaean world may have looked like. Was the kidnapping of Helen really a crime? What rights did Odysseus' wife Penelope have when her husband vanished for decades? Why were there so many people cooking their children and feeding them to house guests? This, my people, is the legal history of the Mycenaeans. Part 1. Who are these people? The modern term Mycenaean is a catch-all. If you went back in time and asked somebody which group they belonged to, they would answer with their tribal affiliation. Homer, if he existed, called the Mycenaeans by 3 names: Achaeans, Argives, and Danaans. Why 3 names? The story actually begins with a much earlier civilization, the Minoans. Around 2000 BC, the Minoans became sentient, and they formed the civilization on the island of Crete. Across the water on the Greek mainland, there were a group of some other sparsely populated peoples referred to by later Greeks as Pelasgians. Herodotus refers to the Pelasgians as pre-Greek, and they didn't speak a Greek tongue. These are, for all intents and purposes, indigenous peoples, although they themselves probably came to Greece at some point in the forgotten past. The Minoans fall into the Pelasgian bucket. Minoans weren't Greeks, nor were they Indo-European. So around the same time, in about 2000 BC, Indo-European migrants began leaking down from what is now Russia into what is now northern Greece around Epirus. While they were there, their language and culture mixed with the Pelasgian languages, giving rise to what we consider Proto-Greek, the early Greek language. There are 2 ways out of the basin that they called their new home, either by land or by sea. Those who took the land route descended into Greece proper and the Peloponnese. The only thing differentiating these different groups was when they left and when they descended into Greece proper. The tribes were really just names of groups of people who left together. The Achaeans, a group that descended into Greece together. The Ionians, same thing. The Dorians, Aeolians, you get the point. For the next 400 or so years, the Proto-Greeks and whoever came with them slowly infiltrated into Greece proper, spreading their language, culture, and religion, but maintaining the names of the groups that they left with. So that explains the Achaeans. Now we have to talk about the non-tribal names. Homer also called the Mycenaeans the Danoi, the Danaans. Danaans is a name that sounds tribal, and maybe it originally was, but in this context, it's not. It's a geographic name. The myth is that King Danaus of Libya fled North Africa to the Peloponnese with his 50 daughters to escape their forced marriage to his brother Egyptus' 50 sons. Of importance here is that Danaus was an Egyptian prince, and he just so happened to rule over Libya. Danaus and his daughters landed in southern Greece with the curious new invention of the chariot, something that appeared around 1750 BC in Egypt with the invasion of the Hyksos, a Canaanite dynasty that invaded Egypt for about 150 years during what is known as the Second Intermediate Period. This mythical chariot-riding king gave his name to a portion of the Peloponnese, and the people who lived there eventually adopted the name Danaans, hence the geographic context. Historically, we know that the Minoans and probably Proto-Greeks were in the employ of the Hyksos and the Egyptians during the Second Intermediate Period, either as skilled artisans or as mercenaries on either side. I personally think that Danaus was one of those mercenaries who fought in the war and then he returned home to form his own kingdom, because around the early 1600s BC, you see the arrival of a chariot-riding elite in Greece. And so these people who lived in that part of the Peloponnese came to be known as Danaans. It's like saying you're from Connecticut or something. It has nothing to do with your ethnic background. When the Achaeans, an actual tribe, took over, all the people who lived there were referred to as Achaeans. But when the Achaeans eventually left or were overthrown, the people there started using the name Danaans again. Homer also calls the Mycenaeans Argives. Same thing as with the Danaans. Argos is a city in the Peloponnese that more or less predates history, but it became notable during the late Minoan period, possibly due to trade or being under Minoan influence, and those in the surrounding area outside the city took the name Argives. Same thing with Mycenae, and people from there being called Mycenaeans, and people from Laconia being called Laconians, so on and so forth. And so that is the origin of the early Greek people and their many names explained. Part 2. From Minoan to Mycenaean. The Minoan Empire in Crete was at its zenith around 1600 BC. They had massive palaces on Crete complete with flushing toilets, indoor plumbing, and lazy Susans. They were actively trading with Middle Kingdom Egyptians, their Hyksos usurpers, and then with the early New Kingdom kings. The New Kingdom Egyptian king Thutmose III wrote of trade voyages to Keftiu, which is Crete, run by the Minoans, and Tenehu, the land of the Danaans. With all of that wealth and power, they expanded their influence out of Crete and into the Peloponnese, influencing the small mainland cities that already existed there, including Mycenae, Tiryns, and Argos. Again, these early Greeks were already on the mainland, but they weren't nearly as advanced as the Minoans and lived in their shadow. As Minoan influence spread inland, they gave the early Greeks a writing system. The Minoan writing system, Linear A, encodes a non-Indo-European language, and to date it's been indecipherable. The Greeks adapted the Minoan writing system to their own language, the result being what we call Linear B. The advent of writing on the mainland is remembered in the story of Cadmus of Thebes, who famously brought writing to the Greeks. However, in the story, written down much later during the Iron Age, Cadmus was a Phoenician, another people known for their writing system. In the original version, which was long forgotten after the Bronze Age collapse, Cadmus was likely a Minoan. But it wasn't just their writing system that the Minoans gave to the Greeks. They also gave them religion, which they themselves had syncretized from the Egyptians. The chief Minoan deity was a goddess named Rhea. That is not how Indo-Europeans typically jive. They like supreme male sky gods. And so, the Greeks gave Rhea some sons, notably Poseidon, who was their chief Indo-European male archetype god. Now I know what you're thinking, I thought it was Zeus. Well yes, that's true, but that happened later, probably during the Bronze Age collapse or during the early Iron Age. The Greeks decided that Zeus was the supreme sky god and not Poseidon. As John Bury notes in his History of Greece, the representation of Rhea was the double-headed axe, which was called the labrys, which may have been responsible for the myth that the Minoans had a labyrinthos, a labyrinth, in their palace at Knossos, a palace which was likely decorated with many double-headed axes in honor of their goddess. There are no minotaurs in this version of the story, but bull dancing was an actual thing. Now, unfortunately, because the Minoan language is indecipherable and of an unknown language family, we don't know whether they had a law code, any laws, or really anything to say of any importance in general. Other people do attest to their existence, though. The Minoans show up in around 1450 BC in the tomb of Rekhmire in Egypt, the tomb of the vizier which is renowned for its description of Egyptian court procedure, something that I covered in another video focusing on Egypt. The Minoans are pictured bringing gifts to him. Come 1400 BC, though, things changed. After about 200 years of Minoan hegemony, their empire fades out of existence. Some of the palaces were burned around 1400, but were soon rebuilt by another people. The Linear A tablets were replaced by Mycenaean Linear B, in other words, Greek. So what happened? In those 200 years in 1600 BC, the mainland cities, colonies, or outposts of the Minoans gained some sort of independence and had become wealthy enough to survive on their own. The Greeks either flung off the yoke of the Minoan Empire, or better yet, they simply matured and came into their own and began to influence Crete itself, changing the lingua franca of the area to their own Greek tongue in place of the Minoans. The result is that beginning in about 1400 BC, the Greek people, hitherto known as Danaans, Argives, Mycenaeans, etc., became rulers of the Peloponnese under the mastery of the Achaeans. Part 3. the government and legal structure of the early Greeks. These groups were about as related as the governments of America's 13 colonies. They were all technically the same people with a common speech, but had their own governments, currency, rates of exchange, and certain other cultural peculiarities. However, if you look back at the 13 colonies, they all had one thing in common: Christianity of some sort. Some were Catholics, Quakers, Protestants, Anglicans, but they all shared one god. And the same thing goes for these Greeks. Indo-Europeans as a whole have a lot in common. They all worshipped a sky god who was flanked by lesser, more specialized gods. Like I said before, Poseidon was created as an offshoot from the maternalistic Minoan religion to comport with the sky god requirement, while also borrowing some legitimacy from the Minoans. As for the lesser gods, we know that the early Greeks worshipped Zeus, Hera, and a host of other gods and goddesses. Of course, when the stories were later written down, Zeus was the sky god and then was superimposed over Poseidon in the myths. This contrasts sharply with the non-Indo-European cultures, such as the maternalistic Egyptians, whose line of succession went by the females in the family and whose gods mainly came in threes, with many of the gods claiming supremacy at one time or another, as opposed to a fixed, supreme deity. The Indo-European government structure, too, is something that is baked into its DNA, and it's highly similar across broad geographic areas and eras. There was typically a king who served as chief warrior, priest, and arbitrator. Notice I don't say anything about law. He was advised by a council of elders who checked his power and acted in a quasi-legislative manner, with decisions of the kings and elders being subject to the approval of the people, the assembly. These early kings didn't make any laws. In cases of dispute, they acted as mediators and arbitrators first and foremost, rather than judges. The legal functions were more or less religious in nature, and therefore legal power was vested in the king as high priest, but even those religious legal powers were pretty limited. There were certain crimes that the gods detested, and that could be punished by the community at large via the king or council on religious grounds, but otherwise it was up to the individual to exact revenge. In the case of a religious affront, the council of elders, this primitive aristocracy, would act as a jury. We're going to revisit the nature of trials by the council of elders and specific instances of the gods deliberating over the Trojan War and Achilles later. For now, just note that other Indo-European entities such as the Hittites and the Mesopotamian cultures shared more or less the same structure, although those cultures were somewhat more advanced with a several hundred-year head start, resulting in them having written law codes and the like. For example, by 1400 BC, the Code of Hammurabi was already long forgotten at 350 years old. Much like the early Americans, the early Greeks slowly grew more uniform in their government structure due to some enterprising individuals. The coalescence of Greek society via the enterprising individual is found in many myths explaining its process. Part 4. The Rise of the Achaeans. If you track the myths, there was an Achaean around 1300 BC named Pelops. His appearance sets the stage for Achaean hegemony over Greece for the next 200 years, as his rise to power coincided with an Achaean avalanche across most of mainland Greece. From 1300 to 1200 BC, the Achaeans rose to prominence within the peninsula. Now, old scholars thought perhaps that they invaded, they were an outside people who came in and took over. But the latest school of thought is that they simply popped up in several places simultaneously, having already lived there. This Pelops, a Phrygian by birth, which makes very little sense to us, later gave his name to the Peloponnese, the island of Pelops. More likely than not, he was probably really a Danaan. But the legend goes that he was allegedly cooked by his father, Tantalus, who lived in Phrygia, and was then served to Zeus, who, upon realizing he was about to feast on the body of a child, had the boy resurrected. Funnily enough, this was the second time that Zeus had been served a human being, and you could see the story of Lycaon for more cannibalistic acts. The resurrected Pelops, albeit with an ivory shoulder, grew up and he needed a wife, and so he heard of a chariot race hosted by the king of Pisa, Menaleus, which promised his daughter to the winner. Now this isn't Pisa in Italy, this is Pisa in Greece. The Leaning Tower didn't exist back then. There was a prophetic purpose for the race, but we don't have to get into that here. What is important to us is that Pelops won the race, became king of Pisa, got his wife, but in the process, he threw somebody off a cliff, and that falling person cursed Pelops and his descendants. Let's not forget that his genetic line was already tainted by his father Tantalus killing and cooking him. This now being the second curse, it is now safe to say that his genetic line was doomed. The cursed descendants of Pelops were many. One of his sons was named Atreus. Atreus actually existed, and this is the first extant historical figure in the Trojan War epic. The problem is that he existed about 100 years before he existed in the mythical timeline. That is, he existed in our timeline around 1400 BC, not 1300 BC as the myths would indicate. He is referenced in a letter from the Hittites to a rogue vassal state, Matuwada. Atreus of the Ahiawa, the Achaeans, attacked Matuwada's kingdom, evidencing their spread into Anatolia around the same time that they spread into Crete, when Linear B shows up in the Minoan palaces, as discussed earlier. Matuwada ran to the Hittites for help, and they installed him as a vassal governor of certain Hittite border towns in the area of western Anatolia, but he quickly went rogue and he began attacking other cities without Hittite permission. Even worse, on more than one occasion, his exploits totally failed and the Hittite king had to come in and bail him out. Around this time, Atreus attacked Anatolia for a second time, this time with 100 chariots and 1,000 men, but there appears to have been a champion duel rather than a battle, this possibly serving as the inspiration for the later Hector and Achilles duel. Atreus' champion may have lost the duel because the letter records the Achaeans going home. Now safe, Matuwada's disastrous exploits resumed, and at one point, he even allied himself with Atreus to attack Cyprus, which was claimed by the Hittites. Returning to the mythological timeline, the mythical Atreus, son of Pelops, had 3 brothers. He killed his half-brother and fled to Mycenae with the surviving one. Now, Mycenae at the time was a smaller city in the shadow of Argos and Tiryns. Now, Argos was ruled by King Eurystheus, the same king who sent Heracles, another one of Pelops' cursed descendants, on his 12 labors. Part 5. The Blood Crime, Heracles, Atreus, and Priam. That brings us to the first nugget of Mycenaean law in our possession, the blood crime. You see, somehow poor Heracles pissed off Hera, Zeus's wife. She made it so that he saw his wife and 3 young sons as monsters. Returning home one day and believing his house to be beset by beasts, he killed them all only for Hera to lift the spell, revealing what he had really done. It was for that reason that Heracles was placed under the service of King Eurystheus for 10 years and was instructed to do the labors, which were essentially designed to kill him to cleanse his soul of the blood debt. This concept of a blood debt may be a reflection of Draco's later Iron Age law code, solidified by Solon and around the time that Homer may have compiled his works, but likely the concept of a blood debt was a cultural peculiarity of the Mycenaeans inherited from their Indo-European progenitors. Thousands of years later, the same idea shows up in the distantly related Norse, Frankish, and Germanic cultures, this concept of weregild, or blood price, of any person to avoid the costly blood feuds that consumed the Achaeans for multiple generations. Remember the mythical Atreus? Well, he had killed his half-brother, thereby recursing his entire genetic line. This is why it's known as the Curse of the Atreides. Heracles himself was related to Atreus through Pelops in a somewhat confusing way, and was subject to the same curse, as well as others for his own personal blood crimes. While completing his labors, Heracles also went on some side quests. He went to Sardinia, Miami, founded some cities, killed some monsters, but most notably, he sacked Troy. Yes, Heracles defeated the Trojans in a matter of days when the Achaeans a generation later took 10 long years to do the same thing. Why did Heracles sack Troy? Well, for money, of course. King Laomedon of Troy was rather rich. In real life, Troy has little much, if anything, to offer in the way of natural resources, but it did have a harbor. The winds of the sea would blow ships into the harbor where they would get stuck for days and weeks on end before setting sail into the Black Sea, the great unknown mythicized by stories like Jason and the Argonauts. Needing food and water, the sailors would moor their ships and go into the city, which quickly began capitalizing on its natural luck and started collecting taxes. In the mythical timeline, King Laomedon was more than happy to collect these taxes, and was also more than happy to be a stingy son of a bitch. He employed the gods themselves, Apollo and Poseidon, to build up his city. The gods saw manual labor as an escape from their eternal bickering. They did what they promised, but when the gods came for payment, Laomedon claimed that the work wasn't up to par, and he refused to pay them. In response, Poseidon sent a sea monster to destroy the city. Laomedon had the women of Troy draw lots to see who would be the sacrifice to the monster. As it turns out, Laomedon's daughter, Xenia, drew the bad lot and was chosen as the sacrifice to the sea beast. They chained her to some rocks in the sea outside of the city so that she could get swallowed up by the sea beast. Then Heracles shows up on his way back from one of his labors and says that he will slay the sea monster and rescue Xenia, but in return for payment. Laomedon pretended like he still had no money, so Heracles asked only for some magic horses. Laomedon agreed. Heracles does what he says he's going to do, just like the gods did. He rescues Xenia and slays the monster from the inside out, but Laomedon, doing what Laomedon does, refused to pay him. In result, Heracles and his 6 ships sacked the city, leaving only one of Laomedon's sons alive and in charge. His name was Priam. Priam, unlike Heracles, also existed. In around 1250 BC, the Hittites wrote to the Achaeans about a warlord named Penelope, an Aswan prince of some sort. By this time, the Achaeans had established bases in Asia Minor, namely Miletus, where there is archaeological evidence of Mycenaean settlements and architecture. It's possible that Atreus, some generations earlier, operated out of Miletus as he fought with the Hittites. Using their foothold on the shores of Asia Minor, the Achaeans sowed all sorts of discontent amongst the reluctant vassals of the Hittite Empire. One of those reluctant vassals was Penelope, who in this timeline was actually on the side of the Greeks, even marrying his daughter to the ruler of Greek Miletus. This Penelope is mentioned in prior and subsequent texts in relation to Walusa, which is Ilios, which is our Troy. The Hittite king even wrote to the Achaean king seeking the extradition of Penelope, and in that letter the Hittite king says to the Achaean king that they've enjoyed good relations since they fought over the city of Troy, and that they should not let the renegade Penelope ruin it. Yes, ladies and gentlemen, this is textual evidence of the Trojan War, or at least a Trojan War, because the letter dates to far before the mythical war was said to have happened. In any event, based on his exploits, some say that Penelope was the inspiration of Achilles or even a young King Priam. We're going to talk more about Penelope and international law, so to speak, when we get to the Hittites in another video, but what's important to note is that he was around for a very long time, and he was too powerful to ignore, but at the same time too powerful to subjugate. As for the mythical King Priam, after his father is deposed by Heracles, he becomes the king of Troy, and his sister, Xenia, also survives, but she's given to one of Heracles' friends as a war captive, this being the kidnapping of a Trojan princess by an Achaean. Now in this world, kidnapping of war captives was totally normal. It's not punishable by any law, so to speak. In the East, you have debt slavery around the same time. In Egypt, you have indentured servitude, either for war captives or for people who were charged with criminal offenses and found guilty. The Hittites had a recognizable legal system pertaining to slaves. As for the Mycenaeans, it was a free-for-all. Hell, even Odysseus was essentially kidnapped and held captive at one point. Your captives were your captives, and the Achaeans regularly raided Anatolia for laborers to take home. Hesione was one of them. There was only one exception that we will speak of shortly when it comes to the Greeks. After sacking Troy, Heracles returns home to King Eurystheus to be assigned yet another suicidal mission in atonement for his blood crimes. When Heracles ultimately dies, King Eurystheus wants to eliminate his many children, the sons of Heracles, or the Heraclidae as they're known. He left the kingdom with an army to find them, and he left Atreus and Atreus' surviving brother in charge of Mycenae. King Eurystheus died in battle, and the kingdom then passed to Atreus after he killed his surviving brother in yet another blood crime connived by trickery. He killed his brother's sons, his nephews, and he cooked them, much like Pelops was cooked, and then he tricked his brother into eating his own children. The council then exiled his brother for cannibalism, one of the things that the gods don't seem to condone, as was seen several times in the past with Zeus, thus leaving the cursed Atreus as the sole ruler of Mycenae. Atreus is eventually understandably killed due to the curse, but not before he had two sons, our Agamemnon and Menaleus, kings of Mycenae and Sparta, respectively. Part whatever, I lost track. Agamemnon, Menaleus, and Paris. There is no mention of Menaleus anywhere in the historical record. There may be a mention of Agamemnon by the Hittites, who mentioned a Kagamumna, which dates to around the time the mythical Agamemnon of the mid-13th century would have existed, but the jury's out on exactly who he was or to which kingdom he belonged. The letter was from a king of Achaea to the Hittites. It's in the book, the Ahiawa text, written in 2011 by Trevor Bryce, Eric Klein, and a third person whose name currently escapes me. Because Atreus was king of Mycenae, the throne naturally passed to his son, Agamemnon. But Menelaus, the younger brother, wasn't so lucky and had to earn his throne, or marry into it as his grandfather Pelops once did. Now, the king of Sparta, which is Lacedaemonia, the king was Tyndareus. He held a contest, yet another contest, to see who would marry his daughter Helen. These mythical Greeks tend to hold a lot of contests for seemingly important things, just like the Egyptians resorted to boat races for conflict resolution. Doesn't make much sense, but that's how the stories go. The clever and cunning Odysseus of 2026 movie fame advised King Tyndareus to have the contestants all take oaths to support the winner in marrying Helen. This is extremely important later. As a side note, Helen also had a sister who was a little bit less beautiful, Clytemnestra, who was also up for grabs. The story goes that Menelaus won the contest, and in doing so, won Helen. The Greeks then swore, per Odysseus' plan, to support their marriage. When King Tyndareus died, Menelaus became king of Sparta. Agamemnon then married Clytemnestra, the sister, but it wasn't as clean. She was believed to have had a husband, Tantalus, whom Agamemnon killed to free her up for marriage. Infer what you will about the legal status of women at the time. Menelaus and Helen then rule happily over the city of Sparta. On Mount Olympus, though, the gods were up to their usual bickering and trickery. Hera, Aphrodite, and Athena were fighting over which of them was the most beautiful, because they had nothing else better to do. Zeus, sick of their vain droning, organized yet another contest, a beauty contest, to be judged by the most beautiful man in existence, who just so happened to be a Trojan prince. Setting aside the fact that the Trojans were not Greeks and probably worshipped totally different gods save for one or two, this prince had no idea he was a prince for most of his life. The Trojan king Priam, who Heracles had installed as ruler there, received a prophecy that foretold his son bringing about the destruction of his city. Priam therefore tasked a servant with exposing his child on the mountainside. But as all of these stories go, the servant lost heart and turned the baby over to a shepherd of some sort. See the stories of Gilgamesh, Moses, Romulus and Remus, and others for more thwarted attempts of infant abandonment followed by a rise of that infant to greatness. The boy grew up and became drop-dead gorgeous. He returned to Troy for a boxing match, and it was there that he learned his true identity. So now, he's drop-dead gorgeous, and a prince of one of the richest cities on Earth. Now, as an aside, Troy was a big city in the area for its time, but it was nothing compared to the major Bronze Age population centers like Memphis or Babylon. It was kind of like a backwater place, but to the Mycenaeans, it probably seemed huge. So now we have Prince Paris as the most beautiful male, judging the divine beauty contest. To make a long story short, Aphrodite cheated. She plays dirty, and she promises Paris the most beautiful woman in the world, Helen, in exchange for choosing Aphrodite. Except Aphrodite left out a small detail that Helen wasn't just Helen. She was really Helen of Sparta, wife and queen to King Menaleus. Blissfully unaware of that important fact, he picks Aphrodite and sets the destructive wheels of prophecy in motion. In the myth, Paris earns the name Alexandros for acts of bravery. In real life, there was a king of Troy named Alexander who was installed by the Hittites in the 1250s, 1280s BC. This is probably a Hittite translation of the Greek name Alexandros, and it shows that chances are ethnic Achaeans were probably operating in the area of Troy around this time. The treaty at question and issue was a mutual defense pact. This King Alexander needed to supply troops to the Hittites who sorely needed them in their war with Egypt. The Battle of Kadesh was fought about 6 years after this treaty was signed. The Hittites, in exchange, also had to defend Troy. And, of course, the Hittites had some benefit. They were pacifying the western provinces in Anatolia, freeing them up to focus on the Egyptians. This same text also mentions Apollo, the protector of Troy in the Iliad, who was probably a Luwian god who became Greek during the late Bronze Age and Dark Age, when Greeks were running rampant all over the Near East. As you could probably see by now, most of these characters existed, just not at the same time. Their names are real and they all had real stories, it's just that they were all kind of smushed together by Homer and later retellers of the epics. It's like me saying that George Washington and his best general, Benjamin Franklin Delano Roosevelt, led the American army to victory against the Iraqis after the British and their Japanese allies launched a surprise attack on the World Trade Center in 2001, but then George Washington was assassinated in a convertible in Sarajevo, sparking yet another world war. It's a garbled mess of figures and events, but each has some underlying nugget of historical significance. But back to our myth, Aphrodite helps Paris get to Sparta to go claim his woman under the guise of a diplomatic envoy. He is a prince after all, and what better excuse to go see Helen than to pretend that he's on official business. Part 6. I remembered where I was. Zeus' Xenia, the law of hospitality and the kidnapping of Helen. This brings us to our second and probably most important Mycenaean law, the law of hospitality, Xenia. In the Iliad and Odyssey, as well as other myths, the gods are expert shapeshifters, turning themselves into animals, people, forces of nature, and pretty much anything else. These powers were generally used to help the gods sleep with attractive humans, but there were other more innocent cases where the gods would simply show up at your house. Therefore, it was of the utmost importance for Greeks to treat guests generously, feeding, hydrating, and entertaining them before even asking who they were or what business they were there on. Doing violence to a guest was not tolerated. Guests, in return, were expected to reply in kind and to not overstay their welcome or engage in their own acts of violence. There are some differing opinions on how Xenia actually operated. John Burry wrote that Xenia only protected people with some sort of relationship to the host. Total strangers were fair game for murder and capture. In this specific instance, Paris was a known prince, so he was a diplomat and would have been afforded Xenia and expected to conform his conduct to that of a good house guest in return. The majority opinion, though, and this is relying on many instances of Xenia in the other myths and stories, is that all strangers, irrespective to the degree of separation, were entitled to kind treatment. Take, for example, the story of Bellerophon, where the main character was accused of raping the host's wife. Now, it turned out to be false, but his host still had to be nice to him anyway to comport with the laws of Xenia. Whatever the case and whatever theory prevails here, it is blatantly clear that Paris broke the laws of Xenia when he eloped with his host's wife and kidnapped her, which I would say is the hallmark of a truly bad house guest. But remember, didn't Hercules kidnap Priam's sister, Paris' aunt, Hesione? Well, yeah, but it's different. She was war booty. Heracles didn't break Xenia. He wasn't an invited guest. He was just getting even because King Laomedon didn't pay him. Kidnapping in his case was justified, and there's this whole thing with justice being personal to the person. You know, today we have an overarching idea of what justice is, the underdog, whatever. Back then, it was up to you to make sure that justice was done. So, Heracles, being shorted his money, did what he needed to do. Now, some could say that Paris had to exact justice for the kidnapping of his aunt Hesione, and as upset as Paris may have been, now, let's be fair, there's no indication that anything other than sleeping with Helen was on his mind at the time. His kidnapping of Helen as a guest under the guise of diplomatic business was an affront to the gods, an offense against Xenia, and it needed to be punished. Now, I just went into that whole thing about justice being a personal concept. It's true, unless you were a king and the brother of the King of Kings. In that case, restoring your honor was everybody else's problem. Part 7. Setting Sail, Human Sacrifice, and the Council in Action. In response to the kidnapping, the Achaeans launched 1,000 ships. Or so they tried. You see, the winds weren't cooperating. The entire invasion fleet and its many contingents manned by each kingdom's respective king, Achilles, Odysseus, Diomedes, Ajax, Menaleus, Nestor, Idomeneus, Prostaleus, and a couple of other guys whose names I can't pronounce, were stuck at the port at Aulis waiting for wind. Why they didn't attack via their colony at Miletus, which is much closer to Troy, is totally beyond me. But in the myth, the solution was the same solution for every other problem the Atreides ever faced: another blood crime. Calchas, Agamemnon's high priest and the inspiration of this guy, ordained that the only way to gain the winds was to sacrifice Agamemnon's daughter, Iphigenia. The problem is that Iphigenia was at home in Mycenaean, and she probably wouldn't willingly go to Aulis if she knew that she was going to be killed. Agamemnon, in his typical form, created a ruse that she was going to be married to Brad Pitt, Achilles. Predictably, she rushed down to the port city, only to realize that she had been duped. In some versions of the story, she dies. In other versions, she's turned into a deer and is whisked away to some faraway land on the fringes of the Caspian Sea. All that really matters for us is the appearance of a blood crime that curses Agamemnon himself, just as his father and his grandfather were cursed. He pays for his impurity later. Now, on human sacrifice, it looks like it was tolerated in this world. Laomedon was going to sacrifice his daughter Hesione for religious reasons, but still, the generational guilt appears to have stuck, even despite the religious necessity for the sacrifice. So with Iphigenia now dead, the wind suddenly appeared and carried the Greeks to the Anatolian coast outside of Troy. The first 9 years of the conflict are consumed by circumvention, blockading, and flanking tactics. The Achaeans refused to attack the city directly and instead focused on starving it out, occupying and sacking surrounding towns and villages, which is probably a condensed version of the historical Achaean raiding and settling referenced in the Hittite records in the preceding 2 centuries. There is very little of legal relevance for the first 9 years or so of the Trojan War. The real meat of the Iliad and the legal concepts comes in the 10th year of the war. That's the year when all the duels happen, Brad Pitt does some cool stuff, and then the magical wooden horse appears. Book 1 of the Iliad actually begins in the 10th year of the war. Achilles and Agamemnon get into a fight over women, of course, because, they've only been at war for 10 years, and I'm sure they had nothing else better to fight about. They had raided a Trojan allied village, and they captured 2 women, one for each of them. The father of the woman who Agamemnon claimed tried to get a ransom for her, and Agamemnon refused to entertain the offer. The issue is that the father was a priest of Apollo, the protector of Troy, and the father prays to the god. Apollo then casts a plague upon the Achaeans. Now, Achilles then talks to Agamemnon's seer, Calchas, and is told that the only way for the plague to stop is for the daughter to be returned. As he did when he agreed to sacrifice his daughter, Agamemnon begrudgingly agrees to listen to Calchas, but then claims Achilles' woman as his own as a substitute. Achilles then withdraws to his ships with his contingent of troops and promises to sit out for the rest of the war. That is, after he put a sword to Agamemnon's neck. Long story short, Achilles' mother was the goddess Thetis. She went to Zeus to essentially tell on Agamemnon and report on how the High King of the Achaeans hurt her son's feelings. She asked for Zeus to make the Trojans stronger so that Agamemnon would be more appreciative of Achilles and apologize. Zeus agreed to punish the Achaeans, much to the anger of his cow-eyed wife Hera, who absolutely adored them. And, she also hated the Trojans because their prince didn't pick her as the most beautiful. So in Book 2 of the Iliad, Zeus is beset by troubles at work, as a god, and at home with his wife. He needs to find a way to punish the Achaeans, but also find a way to stop his wife from being pissed off and stomping around the house. Zeus has an idea. He sends Agamemnon a dream, a false prophecy that today was the day. Agamemnon, if you attack Troy, you will take the city. Agamemnon woke up, jumped out of bed, and ran to the line of Greek ships to tell them the divine message. But before bringing the news to his troops, he did what was normal of these early Indo-European kings and convened a council of the elders, verbatim. That's what it's called in the Iliad. He told the council of the dream and that he had a plan. Now, the council was understandably skeptical. Agamemnon definitely wasn't the smartest king and has proven himself to be quite foolish before. He told them that his plan was that he was going to feign a retreat and say that it was time for them to go home. The council would then protest and convince Agamemnon and the troops to stay and keep up the fight to raise the morale of the men. The council reluctantly agreed to go along with it and put on the whole show. This is one of the few glimpses of the council that we see, and it backfires hysterically. Thinking that his council had his back, it was, after all, just a few minutes earlier they had literally agreed to go along with this whole game of reverse psychology, Agamemnon marched down to the line of ships and called the Greek troops to assembly. He told them, as planned, that it was time to go home. They lost the battle. It's over. Except the council, which was supposed to speak up and rouse the soldiers to a fight, sat there and did absolutely nothing. And realistically, they had been stuck there with their idiot king for 9 years too. They also wanted to go home. The troops, predictably, gathered up their stuff and ran down to their ships to get ready to make the journey back to Greece. The only person who was able to stop this disaster was Odysseus, who was able to convince Agamemnon to apologize to Achilles. At the end, the mama's boy got what he wanted. This episode, while definitely fabricated and fanciful, shows that the Mycenaean Wanax, the King of Kings, or whatever you want to call him, was not as powerful as some people believe. These early Mycenaean kings were still subject to some checks and balances from the council, and here to say that he was checked is an understatement. Part 7. An Achaean murder trial and compensation for the dead. The next notable legal mention from the Iliad comes from Book 18. It's the chapter where Achilles finds out that his close friend, and if you read the recent book Song of Achilles, his gay lover, Patroclus, was killed by Hector. Achilles had lent Patroclus his armor, very, identifiable. Hector, thinking that it was Achilles, struck and killed Patroclus. Achilles then swore revenge and requisitioned new armor from the divine armorer Hephaestus. Hephaestus then endeavored to build a new shield for Achilles, and this thing must have been massive because it contained like a ridiculous amount of things. It had the earth, the sea, the sky, the moon, the heavens, constellation cities, another city that's besieged, and it has rivers, besiegers, cattle, plowed fields, a royal estate, a vineyard, more cattle, a meadow full of sheep, a dance floor, and a bunch of other stuff. But important for our purpose is one of the first inscriptions that are listed, showing two cities and their inhabitants. Homer describes the scene within the city as a murder trial. The men of the city had gathered in assembly for a trial over the blood price to be paid for another man's death. Remember the blood crime and all that stuff about the Guild? This is that, manifest. The defendant, that is, the accused murderer, claimed that he had offered to pay the blood price to the family of the victim, but that the accuser refused on the grounds that the blood price was insufficient. They therefore sought the arbitration of the Council of Elders, in this case acting as judges. In the description, the men appear as representing themselves, and they're cheered on by their supporters. There were no advocates present, which was normal for the time. The Egyptians, the Hittites, and the Mesopotamians, they all didn't have lawyers. We also get a description of the court, something called the Sacred Bench, a semicircle of polished stone, and that's where the elders sat. The elders would be given a speaker's staff, or talking stick for lack of a better term, and would render their judgments in turn. Strangely, 2 talents of gold were said to be placed in front of the sacred bench, which would then be given to the elder who rendered the most sound judgment as a fee. Now, 2 talents of gold is 160 pounds. That's about $7 million in today's money. If the Greeks had that at their disposal, they wouldn't be attacking Troy and sacking Egypt, masquerading as destitute sea peoples. Nasir, the infamous Mesopotamian copper merchant who gets eternal heat over a couple of minas of copper, the amount of money in dispute there was like $1,500 in today's money. Far cry from $7 million. But aside from the fanciful amounts of precious metal at issue, let's look at the alleged crime, the general punishment, and the trial procedures from other civilizations in around the same time, approximately 1200 BC, because the description on this shield is the only example that we have from a trial in Bronze Age Greece. In the Middle East, we have the Middle Assyrian Law Code, which is contemporary with this time. That law code ended in about 1250 BC, so we're about 50 years or so off. Now, strangely, the law code has more to do with women and sex than anything else, but there is a punishment for murder. The Assyrians would let the murder be 1. Executed, 2. Turned over to the next of kin of the deceased, probably as a slave or, to be tortured or killed, or 3, the victim's family could accept compensation and property. And if the murderer had no property, then the murderer would have to give up his children to slavery. The Hittite law code, which was originally drafted in 1650 BC, closer in time to Hammurabi than now, was in effect for a very long time. There are multiple versions of it that go down until about 1100 BC. So this fits the bill chronologically. It's also important because the Hittites, as we've learned, had direct contacts with the Greeks and are geographically close. In Hattusa, the punishment for murder in anger, is to turn over 4 persons, better translated as 4 heads, either slaves or children of the household. Accidental death, specifically called transgression of the hand, like involuntary manslaughter or something like that, was punished by giving only 2 persons. The debt of having to turn over persons to the family of the victim was inheritable, and it couldn't be cured or discharged by suicide or death. Monetary compensation was reserved only for property damage and bodily injury claims. In Egypt, this is about the time of the later New Kingdom. There's no evidence to contradict that the punishment for murder was death, accidental or otherwise. The court records don't support any sort of compensation being employed to make the victim's family whole. So here we have a bunch of Indo-European and Semitic cultures with mixed results. Clearly, that's not the dividing line for different legal theories that punish murder. I mean, after all, in Hammurabi's code some 500 years before all of this, the punishment for everything was death. So what's really going on here? Some have suggested that the trial depicted on Achilles' shield, it references later Greek laws, or was inspired by later Greek laws. But the Draconian law code, which is probably the first Greek law code that we have, preferred exile for murderers and forbade blood price payments. So I don't think that's it. I think that this is just a genuine memory of old conflict resolution. The murderer could offer a blood price to prevent a blood feud, but it could also be rejected, just as Agamemnon had rejected the ransom for his captive woman, or how Priam himself had to beg the Greeks for his son Hector's body. At that point, if the blood price was rejected, the victim's family could pursue a blood feud, which is what Achilles was essentially doing when he wanted to avenge the death of Patroclus, or they could seek arbitration from the King of Council of Elders if they felt that the blood price paid and rejected was inadequate. After all, there were no laws in Mycenaean Greece, so any intervention was really just arbitration. Was there a fee for that arbitration? Maybe, but we see later on that similar cultures did develop the blood price and set it down in writing to prevent such conflicts from happening. This is just a much more primitive version of that. Part 8. The Little Iliad and the Odyssey. The Iliad ends with Achilles avenging his friend or lover or whatever, using his newly forged weaponry to kill Hector, but as you know, the story doesn't end there. The story is then picked up by what's called the Little Iliad and a host of other fragmentary works which cover the Trojan horse, the fall of the city, and the rescue of Helen. So, Achilles kills Hector, but then gets killed by an arrow to the heel, which is his only vulnerable body part, hence the Achilles heel, with the arrow being shot by Paris and guided by the Trojan protector god Apollo. The Greeks then fight over who gets his armor. Now, it's unclear whether this is one or two sets, because Hector took Achilles' first set of armor, and then Achilles had the second one made, and then he kills Hector, so maybe at this point he has two or one. This is a major plot hole. The problem is, though, is that people want Achilles' armor. Achilles is famous. The council forms again, and Agamemnon becomes convinced that Odysseus, the most cunning of the kings, is the next most powerful Greek after Achilles, and of course, after himself. There was another Greek in contention for the armor named Ajax. He was an absolute unit, so much so that the dishonor of being placed behind Odysseus in ranking drove him to suicide. Now, Odysseus eventually does the right thing and gives the armor to Achilles' son. So then the Achaeans sack Troy, but not before Odysseus removes a sacred object from Athena's temple, thoroughly pissing her off. But you know the story. They build the horse, they rescue Helen, and they start home. This is the beginning of the Odyssey. The long and short of it is this. The Greeks, as they sacked the city, killed a lot of people and did a whole bunch of other unsavory things to them in the temples dedicated to the gods. This angered specifically Hera and Athena, who, remember, they hate the Trojans after Paris chose Aphrodite, who concluded that they were going to scatter the ships of the Greeks on their way home. Part 9. Paris and Menaleus on trial in Egypt. We're going to come back to Odysseus later because his journey has some interesting legal themes, but for now we're going to focus on the other Greeks who started for home after the war. Agamemnon goes home and gets there just fine, except he's killed by his wife, Helen's sister, and her new lover. Agamemnon's wife was kind of pissed off that her husband sacrificed their only daughter in the name of wind to go save another woman. Fitting in with the myth, blood crimes are bad, and the curse of the house of Atreus finally caught up with Mr. Agamemnon. Nestor is really the only king to escape unscathed because he didn't engage in any egregious looting or bad acts and wasn't boastful. He was thankful to the gods, made the right offerings, unlike his Greek brethren who decided that they were going to take credit for the victory because of what they did. Had nothing to do with the gods. Menaleus and Helen go home too, but they get stuck in Egypt for 7 years. Now, I covered this in another video when I covered the ancient Egyptian laws, but I'm going to repeat it here. Herodotus, some 700-ish years after the events in the Odyssey, wrote a stunning account of the kidnapping of Helen that is wildly consistent with New Kingdom Egyptian court procedure. He wrote that King Proteus, the son of Pharaoh, which is a botched rendition of Pharaoh, was king when Paris abducted Helen and took her back to Troy, except they were blown off course on the way home and ended up in Egypt. At some point, Paris's men got sick of him and got sick of being stranded, and so they went inland for help, abandoning the prince and his abductee. As his staffers wandered around Egypt, word got out that Paris had abducted the Achaean queen. The local authorities escalated it to the vizier, who then escalated it to the pharaoh. The pharaoh then summoned Paris for a hearing. That's how things worked in New Kingdom Egypt. The parties would be summoned to the Great Court or to the court of the pharaoh to give testimony regarding their acts. Whoever presided over the court, be it the pharaoh, the vizier, or a lesser official, was both prosecutor and judge, questioning the accused incessantly, sometimes employing beatings to discover the truth and render the appropriate punishment. You could see my Ancient Egypt series for more specifics on the types of punishments for certain crimes in Egypt, etc. Here, the pharaoh questioned Paris as to his crime and concluded that he could not punish or kill Paris because he was from Achaea. He was from another country, and the pharaoh knew not the laws of that land. Instead, what the pharaoh did is that he took Helen and the treasure that he stole from Menaleus and held it so that the rightful owner could someday come and recover it. In the Odyssey, Menaleus actually shows up in Egypt, but after rescuing Helen. In Herodotus' account, when Agamemnon's army reached Troy, the Trojans threw their hands up in the air and said Helen was actually in Egypt. She's not here. The Greeks, thinking that they were being gaslighted, didn't believe them and burned the city to the ground, but found no trace of the kidnapped queen. It was then that they realized that, oh, well, maybe the Trojans weren't lying, and that Menelaus set sail for Egypt to collect his wife. He picked her up and also picked up his treasure, but then sacrificed 2 Egyptian children, which was, again, okay under Mycenaean cultural norms, but definitely not under Egyptian law, and was then hated and pursued by the local populace, chased into Libya, and then eventually back home to Greece. The Libyan connection is interesting, because this Proteus, son of Pharaoh, may have been Merneptah, son of Ramses the Great. Merneptah erected a stele in 1206 talking about how he defeated the Sea Peoples who had invaded overland from Libya in alliance with Libyan chieftains. The Battle of the Delta happened in the next incursion during the reign of Ramses III. The first set of Sea Peoples came from Libya. The stele explicitly mentions the Equish, a group understood to be the Achaeans. Menaleus was an Achaean who retreated through Libya and went home after 7 years. Herodotus gets a lot of things right here. He gets the legal procedure right on the money 700 years after the fact. He also identifies that there's Achaeans in Egypt that came to or from or through Libya. So I think that the Iliad is really the Greeks versus the Hittites, and the Odyssey is the Greeks as sea peoples versus the Egyptians. Just some food for thought. I'm not saying that this is true. Now we have to turn back to Odysseus. Part 10 or 9, something like that. What were Penelope's options? Odysseus was probably the best and most prolific Achaean raider after Atreus, if he existed. We're now going to turn our attention to him. He besieged Troy for 10 years and then got lost at sea for another 10. All of his comrades returned home somewhere between 10 and 17 years later after they initially set sail, so he was by and far the last one to make it home. Presumed long dead, suitors started to show up at his house, harassing his wife Penelope for marriage so that they would become kings of Ithaca. Remember the laws of Xenia, the law of hospitality? Well, that meant that Penelope and Odysseus' son Telemachus had to cater to the suitors and feed them. However, the suitors also had an obligation under Xenia not to be pigs, which they clearly did not live up to. Eventually, Odysseus comes back and kills all the suitors in retribution for their failure to live up to Xenia. This idea of Xenia comes up again when Odysseus lands on Ogygia and meets Calypso, where he stayed for 7 of his 10 years, most of which didn't seem all that bad, and also to a degree when he meets Circe, although she kept turning his men into pigs, which isn't very nice, but at the end she willingly let him go, kind of making up for it. Now, Xenia aside, what options did Penelope have when her husband was presumed dead? Today, being presumed dead is a judicial finding. It's a legal status that renders you legally dead without your body. There's a notable modern example. It's the case of Walter Dixon, a guy who fought in the Korean War. He was presumed dead, although they didn't have his body, and they even published obituaries in his town's newspaper. His wife moved on and married another man, and she had 1 or 2 kids with the new husband. The issue is that Walter Dixon wasn't dead. He was a POW. After the war, he was freed only to return home to find his wife was no longer his wife. Because he came back to life, him and his wife were technically still married and have to get a divorce. Because she had kids, she chose to stay with the new husband. Walter Dixon's wife had options. Odysseus's Penelope didn't. If you look at the Iliad and the Odyssey, the marriages that we see were contrived all by men. Helen's father had a contest, Pelops got his wife in a contest held by the woman's father, Agamemnon killed his wife's first husband to claim her. Women didn't have the right to initiate anything, marriage or divorce. In Penelope's case, her father, who was presumably still alive, would have been the one to dole her out to a suitor in the absence of Odysseus because her son Telemachus wasn't of the age of majority. And to avoid that, she stalled for years, weaving and, doing all that famous stuff. But if you were a male, you had options. There were laws in the Bronze Age that protected your marriage so that what happened to Walter Dixon doesn't happen to you. Have to go back a few hundred years to 1770 BC, before the Achaeans were even a dream, to the law code of Xenia in Mesopotamia, which was a contemporary to Hammurabi's kingdom. In Xenia's code, if a man was away for an extended period of time due to war or captivity, and the wife remarried thinking he was dead, he would automatically get his wife back upon his return. Applied in this case, Penelope could have been betrothed to another, but Odysseus would have gotten her back the second that he set foot back on Ithaca. From what I could tell, Xenia's law code is the only instance of a specific provision for people dealing with people possibly missing during war. Hammurabi's code doesn't address it, the Hittite code doesn't address it, none of them do. But as you know, Odysseus does come home, he does reclaim his wife who had not yet remarried, and he kills all the suitors who were plaguing his house. And what's the first thing that he does? He sets sail again to do more Achaean pillaging. In the succeeding years, the kings who fought in the Trojan War all die out, and their successors last no more than 2 generations, which brings us down to about 1100 BC. Most of these kingdoms are supplanted by the Heraclidae, or the sons of Heracles, and the Dorians in this context, who likely rose up against their Achaean overlords and took over for themselves. The Achaeans, well, they suddenly end up all over the place, across Asia Minor, Cyprus, into Syria, with a place called Hiawa showing up in some of the later Bronze Age records, and later they end up in Italy. Were the Achaeans now transformed into the guise of the Sea People responsible for the collapse of the Hittites? Probably not. Hittites were exhausted after a 2-front war with Egypt and a power struggle with the Achaeans in Anatolia, and were probably taken out by another mountain people, the Casca. The destruction of the Hittites, though, probably made it easier for the Achaeans to go abroad while their homeland palaces were burned to the ground by usurpers, possibly personified by the suitors in Odysseus' home. One of the last Mycenaean inscriptions that we have is from the so-called Palace of Nestor. It's a hastily written tablet warning of strange ships on the horizon and ordering the mustering of defense forces. The tablet never made it out of the palace and was baked in the flames. And Merneptah's stele, which references the Achaeans, well, the Achaeans vanish after that. The next inscription, from the reign of Ramses III, references the Danaans, so it's clear that whatever Greeks came from the Peloponnese no longer identified as Achaeans or operated under an Achaean banner, and instead reverted to their pre-Achaean identity. After that, Mycenaean civilization goes dark, so dark that they turn centuries of half-remembered events into an epic of a single generation, and totally forgot one of the biggest players in the region, the Hittites, the same people whose records have provided the only textual corroborating evidence for something that we could call a Trojan War. Now, what about the Trojans? Did they have laws? Our sources are scarce. The Aeneid, the Roman villain origin story myth, provides little insight. It talks about the Trojan prince Aeneas writing and preparing laws both in Troy and then later in Italy, but it was written 1,000 years later with a specific purpose in mind, to legitimize Augustus's new law code. I'll talk about that in a later video, but the whole story was really a legal and political propaganda piece for Rome's first emperor based on the Greek epics. The Trojans themselves didn't leave us any records. We don't even really know who they were, what language they spoke, or how they functioned aside from being caught in the crossfire of the 2-century war between the Greeks and the Hittites. However, in the time immediately preceding the Trojan War, Western Anatolia and the so-called Assawa Confederation was picked apart by the Hittite Empire, and Troy itself was vassalized. The Hittites had a law code, and we have a copy of it. So the next video is going to be on the law of the Hittites, including diplomatic relations between the Hittites, Greeks, Egyptians, and others, with our first and only look into so-called Bronze Age international law. Sources. I regularly get asked what sources I used. For this video, I used the following. I referenced the Middle Syrian Law Code, the Hittite Law Code, the Kingdom of the Hittites, and a second book on the Trojans and their neighbors by Trevor Bryce, the Ahiawa texts written by Eric Klein and Trevor Bryce, John Burry's History of Greece, chapters 1 through 3, the works of Herodotus, and of course the Iliad and the Odyssey themselves. If you have made it to the end of this video, I am very grateful for you. If you've enjoyed this video, I ask that you please subscribe. Otherwise, thank you for watching.